Hello and welcome to the Watercolor Orchid session of the Summer Creative Retreat. I'm so happy to have you with me today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Bucciarelli and I'm a Canadian money designer, creator of all things intricate and colorful. My biggest passion is watercolor, and I'm so excited to be painting these pink orchids with you today. Just a quick reminder that you can download a reference photo as well as black and white outline and my watercolor painting reference in the video description below. I will take you step by step through the entire painting process, layer by layer. You can follow along or simply watch and note the techniques. I promise for anyone who loves watercolor work, especially watercolor botanicals, this will be an extremely useful lesson as we will practice some essential watercolor techniques that you can use in any of your botanical work. All you will need for this workshop is some water, good watercolor paper, and I'm using Arch cold pressed 100% cotton paper, 2 round brushes, one slightly larger, perhaps in size 6 or 8 for larger washes, and something a bit smaller, a round brush in size 2, 1, or even 0 for those tiny details in the middle of each orchid. And I will show you our simple color palette in just a moment. So if you're ready, let's get started. Our color palette is quite straightforward. We will need some vibrant pink for the main orchid petals, and I'm going to be using Quinacridone Magenta. You can find it in most watercolor sets like Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton, or Core, and we will need something a bit warmer for the middle part of the flower, what's called an orchid lip, and I'm going to go with permanent alizarin crimson from Core, also quite a popular color that you can find in most sets, but feel free to use your own favorite warm red. You can use something like Winsor Red Deep or even Quinacridone Red. Just make sure that there is enough contrast between your cooler pink and your warmer red. Finally, for the shadows, you can go with something like Quinacridone Violet, or you can even go deeper and pick a purple, and I will show you both Quinacridone Violet and Dioxazine Purple. Both will mix very well with magenta, and we'll use it mostly in the second layer for the shadows. We may also need some yellow just for initial underpainting. There are a few small details in the middle of each flower. I'm going to use 2 different yellows, but just feel free to pick the warmest yellow on your palette. And for the stems and small flower buds, we'll need 2 greens. We're going to need some very warm light green, almost yellowish green, and we're going to need some darker, more saturated green. You can use something like Sap Green or pure Hooker's Green or even Perlin Green if you want. So before we get to use our pinks and reds, we will need to do a quick step to make sure we prepare the middle of each orchid flower. We're going to start by painting a few small yellow spots on some of the orchid petals, but more importantly, in the center of each flower. If you look at the reference photo, you will see that there's a little bit of that warm yellow, almost like a light orangey yellow, shining through the red and the pink. So in order to achieve a realistic effect, we want to capture that yellow color first and then follow with our vibrant pinks and reds afterwards. So just pick your favorite warm yellow or light orange. I'm using Benzo Yellow from Core, and gently put down a few strokes in the center of the flower. Use your larger brush. Here you can see I'm going with my size 4, a Skoda round sable brush, an old brush. I'm really not worried here about having a precise tip, just covering that area and then using clear water to blend it out. It may be helpful to look at the reference photo at this stage and just check where you can see some yellow colors. I may switch to a warmer orangey yellow just to show you what that may look like. You don't have to use multiple yellows, just use your favorite warm yellow, but this one is called Hansa Yellow Deep from Daniel Smith, and you can see it's just a bit of a warmer look. Notice that on the lip of the orchid this area that will eventually be mostly red, I just covered those two edges with my yellow color and then blended with clear water. Let's repeat the same process on the right hand side. I'm going to start with my warmer yellow, blended with clear water towards the right. Do that small bit visible between the petal and the lip, and move to the left and up to that large petal in the background. A bit of yellow, blend with clear water, and now just the tip of this petal facing us, blend with clear water, and the same thing on this petal. And now let's leave the yellow to dry. In the meantime, just grab your favorite warm green, and you can add actually a little bit of that yellow that you just used into it and just cover the stem. Maybe add a cooler green on the right while that area is still wet. And then you can see I've left a tiny spot without any color. It's going to be a bit orangey yellow later on. And then very quickly, as it's drying out, pick a little bit more saturated green. I'm using Sap Green, and just draw a thin line in the middle. It will add a little bit of a sense of volume to your stem. You can even follow with something deeper and cooler like Hooker's Green. Let's do the same thing on the right. And I'm starting with my mixture of yellow and sap green, just gently dragging the brush across and trying to stay within my outlines. It's a very light mixture, so lots of water here. And now, just like I did in the first part, I'm gonna drag a tip of my brush with a little bit of Hooker's Green as that area is drying out, and you can see it just sort of spreads nicely. I may help it by just dragging my brush near the edge of that color, and you can see it adds a little bit of volume. Don't worry too much if you can't get this step right. This is just a stem, and we're going to come back to it in a minute. And now it's time to play with our pinks, and I've picked Magenta. This is Quinacridone Magenta from Core. You can find a similar pigment in most of the watercolor brands available on the market, so like Winsor & Newton, Daniel Smith, Schmincke. It's a quinacridone pigment, meaning it's super staining but also transparent, which is why I love quinacridone family of colors. And you can see the mixture I made is very, very light, and I'm going to continue adding a little bit of water just to keep the same saturation throughout the painting. Let's work on the left orchid first. We have this big petal, and I'm going to cover it with clear water all the way through. I put the light on an angle so you can see the reflection and kind of estimate how wet my paper is based on that. Now let's add our mixture to it, starting from the base of the petal so that it spreads towards the edges, and as a result our edges are going to be a bit lighter, creating that nice natural transition. I'm using a smaller brush. This is size 2 Winsor & Newton. And now I went for more saturated pigment, and I just basically put it right there at the base of the petal. And now we have that saturated pigment spreading through and out towards the edges. Let me show you again on the right hand side. First, clear water. Now you can't see the reflection, but let's just say my brush is not dripping with water, but it's enough for it to stay wet for a couple of minutes. And now I'm adding my mixture, just helping a little bit with the tip of my brush, helping it flow. And now I rub the tip of my brush on the color, so I didn't put it in the mixture. I put it right on top of the juicy color, the pure color, and now I'm putting that color in carefully just at the base of the petal, watching it spread. So you should have this sort of transition from pure saturated magenta to lighter magenta and all the way to almost pure white. Let's try this method on this orchid on the right, but this time just go straight with your pink mixture. Don't worry about covering it with water first. That petal is in the shadow because our light is coming from the left-hand side, and so there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for having very light or almost white color. So you can see I covered it with my mixture, and then I blended it with a little bit of clear water just on top, and then I'm going to carry it over straight into the next petal. So on the left hand side, our pink mixture is just slowly sinking into paper, and we're working on the next petal, so we have a smooth transition from left to right. And now I'm going to even add a little bit more magenta to it. Again, this flower is facing away from the sun, and so that's why we can add a bit more saturation there. Just carrying it all the way almost to the edge, and then clear water. Now again, let's get some more saturated pigment and start putting it in the base of the petals. Just play around with it, see how much you need. If you don't see the same kind of transition as what you see on the screen, don't worry about it too much. Just play around with less saturated pigment and more saturated pigment. You can even add a little bit of red at this stage. This red will be using on orchid lips, but you can always add just a tiny bit of it into your pink petals, because there's always a little bit of a reflection on the petal from other objects, flowers, leaves, petals that are surrounding it. Now let's do this petal to the left, and you can see I covered it with clear water and then just adding my magenta mixture, letting it spread out and almost cover that yellow tip. Here on those petals that are facing away from us, we may want to use the same magenta mixture but add a little bit of cooler pigment to it, so you can mix your magenta with a little bit of violet there. And the reason for doing that is cooler pigments like blues and violets and purples look further away, because on the spectrum they're positioned on the other side away from the warm pigment, so our eyes perceive them as being further away. And that's just a little trick you can always use if you want to set something back visually on paper. Use a similar color but with a little bit of a cooler undertone. I'm just going to add a little bit more magenta there at the base of that petal and see it spread out. You can only do that if that petal is still wet, of course. And now let's come back to our first orchid. That large petal is dry, so I'm not worried about my pigment spreading into it, and I'm going to do the one on the side. Cover everything with water, and then just drop my magenta and water, my light mixture there, carefully going around the orchid lip so we don't get any color there. We're going to work on those details later on. For now, we're just doing the first layer, and it's important to leave the orchid lips blank for now. We're going to be using mostly warm red there. Now let's do this other petal directly on the other side. Again, I'm going around the orchid lip and around the petal that's on top, and I'm just going straight with my water and magenta mixture because it's so much in the shadow. I don't need to start with clear water, and blending it though with clear water towards the edge. Maybe add a little bit more magenta wet on wet to both of these petals just to add more contrast. And again, you have to do it quite fast while your paper is still wet. Now let's come back to our orchid on the right. The reason why I'm jumping from one petal to another is because I always want to work on the petal that is surrounded by dry area. So in case you're wondering why we're not doing one flower at a time, that is the reason. I just want to save some drying time and show you every detail so that you can see the full orchid branch kind of come alive. So here I started with clear water and then just continuing down with magenta mixture all the way to that area that's already been painted. And you can see where on the right and on the left where I've added a little bit of red into those side petals. Now there's a nice contrast. Pure magenta in the middle and then magenta with warmer red on both sides. Just a slight color variation, very subtle, but it helps create more realism and some visual interest there. Now another petal sticking out from the back. Again, those petals that are in the back, we really want to keep them out of focus. So I'm using my Quinacridone Violet and then blending it with clear water. Violet has a lot more blue in it compared to magenta and red, and so immediately those warmer petals kind of pop and look closer to us. Similar thing on that flower on top. Start with a light violet and then blend with clear water. Another small bit just peeking from the back there, and I'm using the same method. A little bit of light violet and then blend with clear water. We really want to avoid putting too much detail on the two orchids that are visible there in the background because we want the other two to really be the focus of the composition, and we'll spend a lot more time on them. We'll add lots of detail, lots of tiny little dots and spots, and they will look lovely and realistic, and those orchids in the back will not overwhelm them. I think we have one last petal left, and I'm just going to cover it with clear water and again just go in with my pure magenta. It spreads so nicely, it's going straight up. If your paper is on an angle, make sure that the angle works with the direction you want the paint to spread. So if you want it to flow up, make sure that you're positioning it accordingly, or just lay it flat the way I do. Okay, and now it's time to do those small details. They're called the lips of the orchid in the middle, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see my every brush stroke. So we're starting with the orchid on the left, and just go with your favorite deep warm red. So it has to be somewhat different from your magenta, a lot warmer, and I'm using permanent alizarin crimson from Core. Again, you can find this color in most watercolor ranges. You can also use something like Quinacridone Red. And cover the left side, maybe even drop a little bit of magenta on top, wet on wet, and then switch from full coverage to just putting tiny dots, just with the tip of your brush. And continue down. Here, having a good round brush with a precise tip would be very helpful. I'm just using the same round sable brush in size 2 from Winsor & Newton. You can even go lower to like size 1. And here's a close-up of the reference photo. You can see there's a lot of intense red in certain places. So I start sort of light and then add more saturated pigment as I go in those areas that are really begging for some deep, rich red color. A few more details on the right-hand side. There's still some spots visible, so I'm just trying to replicate what I see in the reference photo, but I'm not too concerned about replicating the exact amount of dots. Just sort of trying to mimic the direction of those dots. I think that would help a lot more with the sense of realism. And this part here is a bit tricky. Don't worry if you can't get all the details right. There's a little bit of a sort of a whisker visible there, and I'm trying to paint around it. You can simplify if your brush is too thick at the tip and just do a small curve instead of all those details. And blend with clear water. Note that I left a tiny strip of yellow on the edge, and that's important because that orchid lip is quite thick, and so that strip of yellow is basically what you see from the side, a bit of a highlight there. And so that will add a sense of a third dimension if you leave it blank, and that yellow that we painted in the first step will help us. So just continue painting around that folded part, finish it off, add a bit more saturated red where you feel like you see a deeper shadow and a deeper red in the reference photo. And now let's finish off the outside parts of the lips. And you can see I sort of started with deeper red, then I'm blending with clear water, and then looking at the reference photo, actually the top looks more pink than red, and so I'm going to maybe add a little bit of magenta later on. For now, I'm just going to paint around that little detail, the yellow heart-shaped detail. It's called a column, and I'm going to use my very first mixture of magenta and water. Also some of those pink details visible through the orchid lips, and then the base of the column is all red. Now it's time to finish off those spots, and notice that they're a little bit elongated, so they're not perfectly round, and so you want to make them look more realistic by adjusting the direction. See how you have sort of two halves of that yellow element with spots, and you have the spots sort of facing each other, kind of like a mirror effect. Just use the tip of your brush and adjust the pressure, and you'll get different shapes and different length of those spots. You can see I'm going very lightly just with the tip of my size 2. Again, you can go down to size 1 or even 0 at this point. We have a tiny little pink area visible right behind the column, and I'm just going to put some magenta there for now, and we'll have an opportunity to come back to that area later, make it a little bit more precise. But now let's just add a little bit more color there in the back, and of course that large area on the orchid lip, the folded part. And you can see that it has quite a strong transition from very saturated pink to very light pink. So I'm just gonna put more saturated color on the edge and then blend with clear water, trying to mimic the natural color. Maybe add a little bit more now with the tip of my brush, just seeing how the pigment spreads. This is called wet on wet, meaning our paper is wet, we put a little bit of color, and then we're adding more as it's drying out. I wanted to come back one last time and paint that column with a little bit more red, just because it looks so dark in the reference photo, but you can judge that by how it's coming out on paper in your version. Just make sure that the overall color balance matches what you see in the reference photo. And now let's repeat the same process, but on this orchid on the right. And I'm using a tip of my brush just to paint some warm red on the right lip, and then as I move towards the center, I'm putting down just a few dots. Notice again, I left a very thin line completely blank, and that is to indicate the thickness of that small element on the flower. Just try to get all the way almost to the edge and then leave a white border. Now this side is a little bit more different. It's getting a little bit of light from the left, and so I started with red and then transitioned to much lighter magenta. I'm gonna go down now and continue with my red, which is alizarin crimson. Just going down and trying to carefully paint around those whiskers, kind of a curved line. It might be easier to get it right with a smaller brush, but I'm trying to make it work with the same size too. And you can see there I simplified it a little bit and removed the very end of one of the whiskers. Again, just use your best judgment and see what's possible given the tip of your brush. You can simplify those whisker shapes even further. And now we have a couple of details left that we didn't paint in the beginning, like the back of this petal. Just very carefully, again, using the same mixture, draw a line and then blend it with clear water towards the edge. It's facing the sun, so it should be quite light. And then paint a few details that are still without any color on those petals that are visible in the back. Maybe even switch to your cooler violet. Again, the purpose of adjusting the temperature or switching from warmer pink to cooler pink is to add some dimension and help our eyes read those petals that are in the background as being further away. So you can see I'm not adding too much detail, just simply covering them with my mixture and then blending with clear water. Now we can finish off the bottom of the orchid lip, because the top part that we painted with red is now dry, and I'm not afraid to accidentally blend those colors. So I'm going to use my magenta and just put down some color on the darkest parts of that area and then blend with clear water. And that's just to indicate some volume. The parts that are closer to us will appear a little bit lighter, and so you need some color variation there. Maybe even come back to that lip on the left and add some magenta there as well, blended with clear water. I see it as being a lot more pink in that area, so keep adding a little bit more color, a little bit more magenta to try to match what I see in the reference photo. We still have the top of the column that we need to paint, and so I'm gonna keep it super light, just a little bit of magenta with water. And then on top, there's some intense magenta transitions that I see. So I'm going to use the tip of my brush and just paint them on top of the first layer, making sure that I stay on those areas that are very saturated. For the buds, just go in with your sap green, maybe mixed with some yellow, and make sure it's transitioning to more yellow as you move down. And then take your red and just drop a little bit of that red into your bud. Notice that I left two little spots blank without any color, and that's to indicate some highlights. The surface is quite shiny, and so adding those highlights will help us keep the shape more realistic. Same thing on the larger bud. Start with more saturated, more green sap green, transition to more of a yellow mixture of sap green and yellow, and then add a little bit of red right into it, wet on wet, while the surface is still wet. And that will give us some very nice natural color transition without having to do too much in terms of the detail. Maybe add a little bit of more saturated green at the bottom, and even add the same green on the shadow areas just with the tip of my brush. And I promised you I was going to come back to that tiny spot on the thick part of the stem, and I'm just using a little bit of my warmer yellow. You can use something like ochre there, and then some hooker's green on top of the stem, right under the petals where there's a little bit more shadow. Alright, so we're done with the first layer. Your painting should look something like this. Don't worry if your transitions look slightly different. The key here is to keep it light on the petals and more saturated on orchid lips. And now it's time to work on the details. This will be a lot faster. We're not going to cover everything with color, but just add some key details. And I'm going to go in with a very light mixture of purple. I'm using Dioxazine purple from Core. You can use something like Imperial purple from Daniel Smith, or just reuse the same violet from before, and just look at the reference picture and put it down where the shadow areas are, and then blend it with clear water. You may even leave some parts without any color. Those will be really light in the end. You can also add a little bit of magenta straight into that purple as you're moving down the petal, just to have a nice temperature transition from cooler purple or violet, if you're using violet, to our base pink. And then use that same pink or magenta, to be more precise, and maybe add a few lines, a few veins with the tip of your brush. At this point, my paper is probably too wet, so when I try to add those lines, they kind of blend into the background. So I'm going to leave it for now and come back to it later, maybe in about 30 seconds or so. For now, let's work on this middle petal. And again, I'm starting with a light mixture of water and purple, trying to paint the shape of that shadow that I see in the reference photo. It's kind of a curved one, and then adding some magenta into it to complete the shape. I think this is looking good. Make sure that it's not too dark, but just a few shades darker than your first layer. And you can drag a few lines out with the tip of your brush just to indicate those veins. Now let's try to do the veins again on this left petal. A lot better now because our paper is a lot drier, and so we can put down some pigment and see it spread, giving it a more natural look, but there's still a faint line with some concentrated pigment. Maybe blend a little bit with clear water, and I'm going to leave it for now. On these petals on the left and at the bottom, I'm just going to use wet on dry, so I'm not going to pre-wet my paper, just like I did on the top petal. Just go in with my magenta, a few very light lines, maybe 2 shades darker than the background, and that's it. Now that area above the column, I think needs more color. I sort of didn't get it right the first time around, but as I promised you in the beginning, there will be an opportunity to adjust things, so I'm just going to add a bit more magenta there, a bit of a bump, like a little strip on top of the column. And now let's move on to the one on the right. And so I'm going to start off actually with just some solid color because I want to make sure that that area looks like it's really in the shadow. And drag your brush out to indicate the veins. And you can see I'm starting a bit thicker, and then my line sort of fades, becomes thinner and fades all the way towards the edge. Let's do the large petal on the right. Same method, same technique as the one we used on the left. First, just a bunch of purple mixed with water in the main shadow area as you see it on the reference photo, and then blend with clear water towards the edges and maybe with some magenta as you move down. And while it's drying, let's add a bit more color in the center. A few small details around the heart-shaped yellow bit that's visible there. We're letting all the color and all the water, we're letting it sink in into the petal on the right so we can come back and do those veins. So let's give it some time, work on other details, maybe add some saturation to the orchid lip, more contrast. I went in with magenta, again right in that spot where I see a bit more saturation in the reference photo, and then I blend with clear water. Okay, so I think enough time has passed and I can come back and put a few lines with the tip of my brush. This time I think I gave it a bit more time because the lines are much more defined, but they're still spreading and blending. So that's a nice effect. I like this a lot more than the first petal that we painted. Now let's add a bit more definition to that petal in the back. And I'm just going in with purple and then blending with magenta, and then eventually just switching to some thin lines. Same thing, perhaps a bit of a lighter color on the back of that orchid. And I'll even add a little bit of green because I feel like there is a stem that's visible, and so you can drop a little bit of green. It will be a nice kind of path transition from the main thick stem on the left to that little green bit visible in the middle and all the way to our buds. And then use magenta, maybe with a little bit of violet or purple, to paint very thin lines on the back of that petal. Maybe a bit more color, and then the small sort of triangular shaped bit that's visible there. Again, purple, magenta. Purple is key so that the petal looks further away in contrast with everything that's next to it. And similar thing on the right, purple, magenta, and then blend with clear water. And look how nicely it's starting to look right next to the front flowers. It's bringing them forward, all those lighter pink areas. Let's finish off the orchid on the right. On this petal, the shadow is quite defined. It has a very defined edge. So I'm going to go in with my purple violet mixture and then add some magenta into it, wet on wet. Maybe define the edge of the petal with a little bit more magenta. Again, this is because our source of light is coming from the left, so there will be more shadows in those areas that are covered. And a few lines, wet on wet. This petal is very dark, but I don't actually see a lot of veins there, so let me just use this as an opportunity to add more color, add more saturation, more shadows. I'm using my violet and putting it in those darker areas, then spreading it out with a clear water on my brush. You can experiment here and add even some red into it. And now I'm gonna go back quickly to that petal on the left. Now it's almost dry and I'm just gonna reinforce those veins with the tip of my brush. A bit more color on the column, moving slowly to the right. Let's start off with some violet, or you can go with purple. Quite light, but a few shades darker than the first layer. Extend it and blend all the way to the edge with clear water. There's a bit of a light part that I left without any color right on top of that petal. And then while it's still wet, I'm gonna drop more of my alizarin crimson. So use your warm red in those areas just to boost the color a little bit. Now the top petal, going with some vibrant magenta and then spreading it with clear water. The petal is facing away from the sun, so you can really go deeper with your colors, more saturated there. And now I'm back to the petal on the right as it's getting a bit more dry, and I'm adding lines with the tip of my brush, just like that. Maybe even on the left, but as I said, I don't quite see a lot of lines there, or at least not as defined as what we have on the right and on top. And here I'm doing the lines on top. So you can see I'm sort of working on 2 petals at a time here just to save some time, putting solid layer of color in one while the other one is drying, and then doing the lines and then switching back and forth. You can do this as 1 petal at a time. Just make sure to give yourself some drying time in between the shadow and then those thin veins. And we're done. Congratulations and thank you again for joining the Summer Creative Retreat. I hope you enjoyed this session, and if you have any questions, do let me know. You can find me on Skillshare, YouTube, and Instagram. If you do end up posting your work, don't forget to tag me. I absolutely love seeing your versions of flowers that we paint together. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the retreat.